Evening, comrades, and welcome to the Labour Left Alliance's now world-famous education series, Global we are. And in the spirit of that internationalism, tonight we're going worldwide. We shall be looking at the truly bloody periods of the United Irishmen, the Black Jacobins resisting near impossible odds, the liberator Bolivar, and all contextualised through the lens of the French Revolution. These can only have been truly phenomenal moments in history, the shock waves of revolution, the impact around the world, and the fear amongst the bourgeois must have been delicious. This evening, it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight's teacher of turmoil, Kevin Bean. Kevin is going to lead the discussion. Then, as ever, we shall open up the floor to share our thoughts, thanks, cogitations, and questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A section. We'd be delighted to welcome you to participate when we delve into discussion after Kevin has shared his presentation. I shall leave you in the very capable hands of our guide to the guillotines, Kevin Bean. So sit back, comrades. Over to you, KB.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. I'm not sure whether I'm able to live up to the billing or to match the alliterative introduction, but we'll see what I can do. I called tonight's talk the First World Revolution, and that was because although there had been movements that spanned continents in both Asia, in Europe, and we think in Latin America, I think that this is the first period in which revolutionaries and rebels in different parts of the world consciously looked at what was happening in other countries, particularly in France, and then attempted to apply lessons, as it were. Now, in some cases, as in the case of Haiti, they were in that country, or San Domingo, that was they were intimately connected to events in France. So it wasn't that they were, in a sense, taking an abstract example. It was a French colony, and indeed events in France would have a direct impact on events in Haiti. But I think it's the wider significance of where we're beginning to see a world which, through capitalism, is being integrated, is being linked together, and in which ideas, and above all political ideas, begin to circulate. And we can see this then in the politics of these three movements, and I suppose in their afterlife as well, the way that these movements have lived on in history, both as inspirations and as guides and as direct influences of politics in other parts of the world. A couple of weeks ago, Dan Lazare, when he was talking about the American Revolution, referred to the Atlantic world. And I think that's quite a good way of thinking of these three movements. They're linked, in a whole number of ways. But what above all links them is their connections through empire, and through trade, and through colonization, and through commerce. They're also linked by individuals who travel between the various parts of the world. For example, the United Irishmen, Irish radicals, predominantly situated in Belfast, but some of them in their later revolutionary phase actually traveled to continental Europe, to France, to gain assistance for their revolutionary attempts. Bolivar, for example, studies in Europe. Indeed, he lives in London for a time, and he has a direct experience and understanding of events in Europe. And of course, the passage to and fro of people from France to Haiti and so on is fairly standard. So in other words, what this Atlantic world has done as to bring people together, initially through commerce, but then the exchange of ideas. And then, of course, later on, when Haiti becomes an independent state, or when it's fighting its revolutionary war, then it too becomes something of a sort of an exemplar. So that movements in the United States, movements in South America, will also take inspiration from events in Haiti. And indeed, at one key point in Bolivar's liberation movement, he seeks refuge in Haiti and actually receives assistance from Pétain at really quite a decisive moment in his revolutionary movement. And as he's later to argue, the man who liberates Venezuela is Pétain, from the leader of Haiti, not Bolivar, because of the assistance they rendered. So we're talking about a recognizably modern world, a world that, although communications are very slow, although literacy is not widespread, ideas and exemplars can spread. And I think that this is perhaps a guide to our understanding of the significance of these events, that we're looking at something that is recognizably like our own world on a much lower scale. But that isolation that we had in feudalism and in the early modern period is really starting to break down. But of course, it's not just the communications that make these events significant. It's of course the ideas. And those ideas are incredibly potent. Now, the French Revolution, which I talked about last week, is a very contradictory movement. Indeed, in many ways, we can think of it as several revolutions rather than one block of an event. The key point, though, is how people interpret that revolution, and in particular its key ideas. And the slogans of equality, liberty, fraternity, those slogans and those ideas, particularly ideas of popular sovereignty, the idea, linked much further into the Enlightenment, of reason, the idea of rationality, the idea of inalienable human rights, above all, the idea of these rights being universal. That the French Revolution isn't just a French affair. It's not just that the French throw off their king, a monarchical system. It's the idea that these rights are universal, that they apply to all humanity. So at this stage, it's still a politics of common humanity. But when you consider what a radical idea that is, of the equality of people throughout the world, the idea of an applicability of these radical ideas, you can see the way that they can ferment and can help to develop local movements. But of course, if we are taking these three revolutionary movements as examples, we could have taken many others, particularly in Europe. We could have looked, for example, at movements in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Russia, in the German states, and so on and so on. We could have looked at movements emerging in the Ottoman Empire, and even some echoes further east as well. Why I've taken these three is that they all have, I think, a set of common characteristics. One, they do throw up really quite serious revolutionary movements, which, in the case of two of them, lead to the creation of particular states. And in the case of the United Irishmen, they do have significant effects on the structure of British rule in Ireland and the formation of the United Kingdom, the union of Great Britain and Ireland in 1800, 1801. But it's, I suppose, a set of common characteristics between the three areas, particularly the idea of local oppressions and local colonization and local tensions, which then feed into these universal politics. So what we don't have are simply people issuing revolutionary proclamations in Paris, and then people think, that's a good idea, maybe we should try this in Belfast, or maybe in Port-au-Prince, or in Cartagena, or wherever. We'll try this out. No, it was because I think that you have a series of oppressions, in the case of Haiti, a colonial and a slave oppression. In Ireland, democratic oppressions, particularly discrimination and political disabilities against the Catholic majority and dissenters. And of course, in the Spanish colonies in Latin America, we have other forms of colonial oppressions between the metropolitan Spanish Empire and the colonies, but also tensions within the colonies between local elites and colonial administrators, and then between other sections of the population. So what we have then are some sort of common experiences, but also, of course, many different experiences as well. Now, chronologically, they overlap to a certain extent. The United Irishmen are formed in 1791. There is a rising at the end of the 1790s in 1798. So that's a neat period which overlaps clearly with the French Revolution. The events in Haiti cover a very similar period, 1791, the first slave revolts, various phases. In effect, Haiti becomes independent becomes formally independent in 1804, but is substantially on the way to independence by 1800 when it has its own constitution. There will be, of course, another French intervention to try and regain the colony, but the pattern's established. The movement in South America is slightly later, and I suppose comes into something of the after effects of the French Revolution, but is very clearly influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment and by that revolution. Begins with the revolt in Venezuela in 1807, 1808, and then moves through a series of wars of liberation through the rest of that decade and indeed into the 1820s. So that, for example, in that period in Latin and Southern America, there are a whole series of campaigns, far too many for me to outline in detail, involving anything up to 100 serious military engagements in which Simon Bolivar's forces establish a series of independent states, initially federations, but increasingly these become separate states of Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama. So really almost a continental movement in that way. And of course, as well as these local movements, we have the interventions of the outside powers. Ben referred to the fear of the bourgeoisie. And indeed, certainly in the case of Britain, the bourgeoisie was terrified of these movements. And of course, in the rest of Europe, the aristocracies were equally terrified, and indeed, on occasions, would in effect join together to suppress these upstart republics. I think that we should also consider maybe the similarities and the differences between the movements. And again, another interesting point of study for us is, how consistent the movements are, the local variations. For example, the Haitian movement, which C.L.R. James probably, did the most in the last century to put on the map for many of us on the left, described the movement as the Black Jacobins, and that's the title of his book, which I'm sure many of you read. It's constantly referred to. And so what we do then is to clearly fix that movement in the sort of framework of the French Revolution. And when we look at the proclamations of the movement, when we look at the activities of its main leader, Toussaint Louverture, my apologies for the very bad French, when we look at the proclamations and the ideas and so on, and in particular its movement from being simply a movement of slaves that initially just want to improve their conditions, through to a movement that wants not only to abolish slavery, but to institute forms of local government, or indeed forms of independence in the colony of Saint-Dominique, then we begin to see, I suppose, really quite a movement away from a simple opposition, from a simple sort of rejection of the established order, towards something else. And in particular, we see really very sophisticated and very developed political ideas. Why I think this is important is that if we look at the reaction to these movements, particularly in the case of the Haitian movement, which in many ways is the most challenging, we see that the established orders are terrified of the impact that this movement will have outside of Haiti. So that, for example, the neighboring islands and colonies of French colonies and of course British colonies in the West Indies find out very quickly what is happening. And indeed, through the normal means of trade and communication, these ideas spread very quickly. And it's that fear, for example, within 4 years of the outbreak of the rebellion in Haiti, there is a similar outbreak in Jamaica. And the idea that as with the French Revolution and its impact in Europe, that there'll be a similar impact in the colonies of the West Indies. But there's another element here, I think, which is interesting. And again, I think shows us the way that the ruling classes of that period saw where they saw the threat coming from. Edward Gibbon, the high Tory author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is a classic of English literature, if not always very accurate history, was a fairly clear opponent of the abolition of slavery. And he wrote that his main fear about abolishing slavery wasn't about property. It wasn't necessarily that even that a natural order was being overthrown. His fears were that if we concede on slavery, then the next step will be democracy. And of course, democracy to for many of the elite bourgeoisie and the aristocracies of the late 18th century, democracy was anarchy. It was the overthrow of property relations. It wasn't necessarily about race, it was about class. So that what the slave revolt did was not only to be the revolt of slaves, it was to interfere with property relations and also the established political order. So the rulers of Europe and other parts of the world very clearly understood that. So what I want to try to do is, rather than go through each movement in detail, that would be 3 talks. Indeed, I think it would probably be 9 talks in all. I'm going to sort of pick out the main features that I think are common and then point to some of the differences and points of, some of the points of significance. I'll start first of all with the United Irishmen. Not only are they closest to home, but also they left quite a legacy of pamphlets and literature and so forth. Now, what we see with the United Irishmen is a movement that begins in essentially a colonial situation, Ireland's relationship to Britain in the 19th century, the 18th century, had many of the functions of a colony. And in particular, the political exclusion of a majority of the population. Now, of course, that exclusion was around religio-political grounds, and it wasn't just simply the class exclusion that you would have had in Britain itself. Now, what the significance of the United Irishmen was that they framed their appeal clearly and simply and directly on the ideas of the French Revolution. Belfast was probably one of the most revolutionary cities in Europe in the early 1790s, with public support for the French Revolution and its ideals. That support emphasized the way that politics, the way that the nation should unite the whole of the people. This again is a relationship that we see in the French Revolution that identifies the nation with the people. And the idea that the people as a whole have political rights, they have human rights, these rights are inalienable, and above all, a conception of popular sovereignty. And that idea of popular sovereignty obviously doesn't exist in 18th century Britain, in the United Kingdom. But of course, in Ireland, it's doubly doubly restricted by the fact that civil rights and political rights are refused to the majority of the population. So the agitation for democracy begins very clearly with emancipation for the Catholic population, but also the dissenters. Again, something which is often overlooked is that dissenters, non-conformist Protestants, were also excluded from political rights in the United Kingdom. So this movement for democracy attempted to unite, in the famous phrase of Wolfe Tone, one of the leaders of the United Irishmen, Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter in the common name of Irishmen. And the focus was on political democracy. And the way to achieve that political democracy was to develop a movement that would unite and bring together the previously disparate groups in the population. And in that aim, the United Irishmen sought, initially through pamphlets and through fairly conventional lobbying, to build a campaign for political reform. But when that was rejected, and particularly through the radicalization of the French Revolution, the United Irishmen in turn were radicalized. There was another feature, I think, that also radicalized them, which of course was not only just the opposition of the ruling class, but their repression as well. And the British government carried out widespread arrests, imprisonments, and disarmament, which seems a mild form, but effectively it means widespread arrests and disarming, and indeed imprisonment and fairly summary executions of opponents. So this colonial movement, this democratic movement, finds itself confronting a fairly rigid, a fairly ruthless state, and finds itself in attempting to develop democracy, moving into that revolutionary form. It does so as well in the period of wars between Britain and France, and so in the way that all revolutionaries look for allies and assistance, they look to revolutionary France, and they make direct contact with revolutionary France. Some of their leaders visit France, and they plan, following the repression, they plan an uprising, and they also ask for French assistance, which they get in two expeditions, but one of them fails to land. Now, the final rising in 1798 is a failure. It's repressed fairly brutally. Indeed, I would say it was probably the single most violent period in Irish history. Casualties, numbering tens of thousands. Pitched battles with pikes, volunteer troops confronting regular troops, and the rising was crushed. But I think it's an example of how these local oppressions and the ideas of that revolution, incubated then by the repression of the state, can lead to a revolutionary ferment. And I think that the experience of leaders like Wolfe Tone, Thomas Russell, Jemmy Hope, and so on, those radicals in Belfast, but in other parts of Ireland, are a good example of how people take ideas and apply them to their situation. A similar connection, I think, can be made with the Haitian movement, and indeed, although the two periods don't exactly coincide, we know that the United Irishmen followed events in Haiti, and indeed when Bonaparte sent troops to Haiti in 1802, Napatandi, one of the sort of leaders of the United Irishmen, who was by that time on the continent, wrote in protest, arguing that the French shouldn't be suppressing, an independent nation in that way. But it's, I think, the afterlife of the Haitian movement is really its dramatic form of the first independent state that has broken away from an empire in which there is a majority Black population. And I think it's that inspiration that gives it its particular character. Again, the events here are fairly tangled, and I will only summarize them in outline. C.L.R. James' account is an excellent one. There is a new biography which I read in preparation for this called Black Spartacus, which again I think is worth reading, although I would have differences with its interpretations, but I still think it's a good account. I will incidentally put a reading list up after this session, along with the reading list for last week. Now, the Haitian Revolt very clearly follows events in the French Revolution. Haiti, or Saint-Dominique, I should say, is a French colony. It's a fairly prosperous, successful French colony. It's successful if you're a member of the elite. It has a very, I think, developed cultural and indeed political society. And that society, although dominated primarily by plantation owners, white plantation owners primarily, it also has a culture which extends much further into the wider parts of the population, particularly the mixed race population, and into the Black population as well. And indeed, one of the interesting things from the evidence that we have is actually that the Black population, the slaves, do have forms of organization. Indeed, it's fairly common for the population to communicate with each other. And there are indeed even forms of not particularly sophisticated political organization, but what we have is a culture of some underground resistance, types of strikes, or, for example, slaves having localized rebellions, or simply running away and then living in remote areas in forms of independence. So we have all of these elements, I think, which will be a very interesting, a very important mix. Now, the rising of 1791 initially turns into a generalized slave rising that doesn't actually simply want initially to abolish slavery, but actually wants to renegotiate its terms. And it does this through the influence of ideas which are coming from France. In particular, the adaptation of the idea of the rights of man and the idea of inalienable human rights, which apply to all of humanity. Now, of course, the French Republic doesn't initially abolish slavery. It does in February 1794. And of course, even the most democratic of republicans in revolutionary France will always find a reason maybe not to extend that. Daniel's talked about the French Revolution in the previous session, and we know the way that people often equivocated on that issue. That sort of contradiction in that way. But what's interesting in this rising is that a fairly sophisticated political ideology emerges. And this ideology around l'ouverture is I think one that is it clearly shows the influence of the French Revolution. It clearly shows the influence of the idea that we are citizens of France, we should be citizens of France, and that we have, these inalienable rights. But it also shows other elements of local oppressions. Above all, it shows the evidence of that particular culture, which I referred to before, both culture from within Haiti, culture from outside. It also shows the influence of the French, of the American Revolution as well. Trade between Haiti and the United States, and so you have this, this quite potent mix in this way. Now, the why Louverture is, I think, such a significant figure is that he's not just an anonymous military leader. He becomes very much the sort of symbol of the revolutionary movement. He becomes, in effect, its military leader. And again, the military experience of this revolution is an absolutely brilliant one. Again, it's often fought against considerable odds. The tactical innovations. Above all, Louverture's appeal to revolutionary and indeed republican discipline. Again, all of the language of the French Revolution, all of the language that is being used to inspire the French revolutionary armies as they fight the counter-revolution in battles like Valmy and so on. So this is not just a general appeal to arms. Proclamations are issued, speeches are made, all of which draw upon this tradition. But of course, it's a confused picture. You have not only the revolt inside Haiti, but you have in the other part of the island, we have a Spanish colony. They intervene, and indeed for a period, the slave rebels, as it were, side with the Spanish against the French. And then, of course, at a later point, we've got the intervention of the British, who, as part of their war against revolutionary France, sensed the possibilities of gaining a colony, but also, perhaps more importantly, of suppressing a slave rebellion. Indeed, one of the first things that the British do when they arrive, some of their very first acts are to reimpose slavery after it has been abolished. So this rather confusing and diplomatic and military situation is resolved in favor initially of the French, which Louverture has in fact joined, and indeed rises to some prominence effectively as the de facto political leader of that French colony. And it's here that I think we see him to develop his ideas about the future of that colony. He argues that although he describes himself as French, although he says that he's a French Republican who stands by the ideals of the French Revolution, that Saint-Dominique must have its own government. It must, in a sense, govern itself. And in the period 1798 to 1803, when he dies, there is, in a sense, a battle between metropolitan France, particularly after Napoleon secures effective control of it in 1799, between metropolitan France and the colony. And it's then that the movement radicalizes and goes for complete independence, and indeed begins to see itself as something of a diplomatic player in the Caribbean world, in that area. Now, the state that is established, there's a constitution that's promulgated in 1800, is again another very contradictory one. It is in many ways a sort of monarchical constitution. Louverture is a sort of governor for life. There are freedoms and abolition of slavery and the establishment of various freedoms, again, very much based on the French Revolution. But in many ways, it's a conservative revolution as well. Catholicism is instituted as the state religion. And in many ways, after the revolutionary excesses, as it were, Louverture is now sort of settling down to some sort of benevolent, enlightened, semi-monarchical system, you know, in some ways possibly influenced by the developments in the French Revolution itself. But even so, even if we want to be critical of that, what we must, I suppose, accept is that this is the first state that's established by a slave revolt. It's the first successful revolt by Black people against European colonists. And above all, it's one that's influenced by those revolutionary ideas. Above all, it will be a movement that goes on to inspire other movements at a later date. And there's a very sort of direct link, I think, between that and movements in the United States in particular. L'Ouverture is commemorated in the United States. There is almost an oral tradition of his state and of his success. And in the late 19th and 20th centuries, Black writers like Du Bois will look at his achievements and will argue that this shows that Black people can govern themselves, that show that a serious movement can be built amongst the Black population. Because of course, what Haiti shows is that that people of whatever color, race, ethnicity, and so on can rule themselves. That the colonist, that the slave, who might well be considered merely a beast of burden or less than human, rather in the way that Gibbon refers to the multitude as a mob, and regards democracy as simply handing rule over to madmen. What Haiti shows is that a functioning state can be built in a country in which the majority of the population are Black, that democracy is universally applicable, that revolutionary ideas are universally applicable. The same thing, I think, applies very much to the situation in Latin America. Again, a very complex pattern of events, and it's more, I think, the figure of Bolivar as the liberator that I think is significant. Bolivar is a member of an aristocratic elite. He, in a sense, represents the colonial elite. Unlike L'Ouverture, who was born a slave, but is actually a free man before the slave revolt. Bolivar comes from the opposite end of the spectrum. Now, his movement, I think, is an interesting one because it represents a number of quite contradictory forces. It represents those sections of colonial society that are unhappy with rule from Spain, rule from the metropolis that rules and exploits the empire. But remember that Bolivar is part of that elite. He's part of the landowning elite. He's not a poor peasant. He's not a campesino or whatever. He's not an indigenous Indian or whatever. He's part of that elite, but even he still feels the restrictions of colonialism. And above all, this idea of self-determination, not expressed in that way, but the idea of the application of human rights, the application that the people should govern themselves. And I suppose in this period, although we will see it later on when we look at 1848 and we look at later events, this very revolutionary idea that the people constitute a nation and that a nation and a people should govern themselves. This is a period in which revolutionary nationalism is progressive, in which the creation of states, the creation of democratic states is inextricably linked to democracy. And so Bolivar, I suppose, embodies this in a revolutionary movement which covers in that 20 or so year period, 18 or so year period in which he's operating, defeats the colonial armies, the armies of the Spanish and of their various local officials, and creates, as I say, initially a federation covering much of the western part of contemporary South America, and in doing so, inspiring other movements which people in other parts of the world look at. I referred last week to accounts of people in Yorkshire following events in South America, following these liberation struggles, and again seeing empires, seeing monarchs, seeing undemocratic elites, seeing these as tyrants, and that this common struggle against tyranny, this common struggle for liberation, was a struggle for all of mankind. Now, at this stage, these ideas are very clearly rooted in the French Revolution. The state that Bolivar establishes is in many ways, again, another conservative state. It's one in which, or the states that emerge, were ones in which there's usually a very, not authoritarian, but a sort of very dominant leader in which he has considerable power, although that's then checked by a Senate. There are forms of election. There will be the abolition of slavery and of the more egregious restrictions on liberty. But there is no real shift in property relations. And I suppose what we're at the stage now is we're at that stage where democracy, the ideas of democracy are revolutionary. They challenge the established order. And what we will see, as with last week with Babeuf, is that those ideas will, I think, start to move from the political to the economic sphere. To a certain extent, we see that in Haiti on occasions, and demands about ownership of property, about how the plantations are to be organized, and indeed about the organization of economic life in general. But that type of class analysis and that type of idea of the restructuring of property relations is not yet widespread. But of course it will be, because once those ideas of revolutionary democracy are out of the bottle, people will then start to see how they can apply not just to political struggles, but indeed to other areas of economic and social life. So just to conclude, comrades, I've tried to do the impossible and probably dismally failed in linking together three movements. I wanted to bring the movements together because I think their common element is being part of that world system, but also the way that in local circumstances, local oppressions, political crises can shape politics, but also the way that revolutionary ideas can travel, and that once people read those ideas, once they understand, then they can apply that to that particular model. They can look at what's happening in France and say, we can do that here. C.L.R. James, when he finished his account, which he wrote in 1938, makes this same point. And although it's been somewhat criticized in recent years as being maybe too Anglo-centric, too Eurocentric, I think in some ways the sort of feeling that he embodies in this still has relevance today. He talks about the Haitian rebels as symbols of the future, and he says others will arise, and others. As he was being sent into exile on board a ship, Louverture said that the tree of liberty has been chopped down, but it has deep roots and will grow again. And he goes on to say, from the people heaving in action will come the leaders, not the isolated blacks at Guy's Hospital or the Sorbonne, the dabblers in surrealism or the lawyers, but the quiet recruits in a black police force, the sergeant in the French native army or British police, familiarizing himself with military tactics and strategy, reading a stray pamphlet of Lenin or Trotsky as Toussaint read the Abbé Réal. In other words, when C.L.R. James was writing this in the late 1930s, he was looking at what was then the domination of European empires throughout the world, and he was predicting that revolt that would come, as it indeed did come in the years after the Second World War, and indeed was to extend into the 60s and 70s. And it's movements like the Black Jacobins, it's movements like that which draw inspiration from other revolutionary movements that he was referring to. And it's movements like that that I think we too have to draw inspiration from as we hear of movements today going on throughout the world, and we act in solidarity with them. But of course, the best act of solidarity is what we do at home, is where we continue our struggle here, and the aid that we give to workers in this country, and of course then internationally. So thank you, comrades. I'll take questions. What I would suggest is, last week it did seem to work quite well to do individual questions. So I'll take it like that if people do want to ask questions. Okay, thanks, comrades.
Thank you, KB. An absolute masterclass. Fascinating. If anybody missed it, the reading lists are available. Quite how revolutions ever got going in a time with no mass communication as we know it today will endlessly fascinate me. Comrades, do put your questions in the Q&A, and if you would prefer one of us to articulate it for you, that'll work. While we're doing that, while we're promoting comrades to panelists, can I ask Kevin?
I have got one question from Ken Syme, so I'll answer that. But you can ask a question, Ben. That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, how did the revolutions of sort of the 18th century, 19th century, how did they ever reach critical mass? Was it sheer inequality? Was it the scale of barbarity? Was it the aristocracy making such huge misjudgments? What do you think was going on?
Well, I think you can't really put down one answer, and I think your point about critical mass is an important one. I put a lot of emphasis there on ideas, and I talked about the way that French revolutionary ideas circulated, and I talked about the ideas of the Enlightenment, which clearly existed in Haiti before the outbreak of the slave revolt. And one thing as well that struck me when I was doing a bit of preparation, particularly the new biography, which has got some more evidence in it, was that we tend to think of slave societies, and Britain, unlike say the United States, doesn't have a lot of sort of direct experience of slavery in the home country, as it were. But we tend to think of slaves often, in, I suppose, from our own popular culture, as people who are manacled and sort of kept apart, and then as fairly sort of docile people who are sort of wheeled out. I know that Americans wouldn't have that view because, of course, slave revolts and so on, were fairly well known. But what I suppose I'm trying to say is that we know that communications in the population, the slaves, and indeed people who'd recently been freed, people of mixed race, Louverture, for example, at one point was a coachman for one of the plantation owners, and he traveled around a considerable distance. And we know as well that there were underground societies, secret societies, often that had a sort of religious function. We know, for example, that some Jesuit priests were, very supportive of the slaves and agitated, and indeed even used sort of religious services as a way of bringing people together. In other words, the sort of ideology, I think, is there. There is a lot of ideas that are around. In terms of the critical mass, you're talking about sort of collective organization. Again, slaves did have forms of collective organization. And not only did the very slave revolts and people simply abandoning the plantations and running away and, you know, living as free people in the mountains and the forests and so forth, but there's also evidence of strikes. There's also evidence of sort of go slows and negotiations. In other words, there is a, you know, it's a degree of consciousness there. Now, I don't think, I mean, you know, I don't want to sort of promulgate any sort of general revolutionary laws. You know, that's not what I'm really trying to do. But I think that that what you often have are not just you know, sort of oppression of piled upon oppression, but how often it's, I suppose, the sense of possibility. I mean, this is debated by historians, not just revolutionaries, but of all historians. And de Tocqueville, the French bourgeois liberal historian of the 1830s and 40s, he suggested that, in fact, in France, that the trigger to the revolution wasn't necessarily, you know, repression that was unbearable. He actually seems to suggest that it was when people thought they could win. In other words, when they thought that they had a chance of changing it. So if you, for example, feel that the current situation is the only one, that there is no alternative, then maybe you you know, you accept it. You may not like it, but the possibilities of changing it may be limited. Now, what we have in the 1790s is a long tradition of slave revolts, but we also have the news from France that a large part of the established order has suddenly been overthrown. You know, the king has been overthrown, he'll later be executed. You know, the old order is gone. And so I think if you bring these two things together, then I think you can see you know, some sort of development in that way. I think the same thing is also true in the other two cases I mentioned. Again, in the case of the Bolivarian movement, you've got really you know, a whole number of possibilities there in terms of its leadership from the colonial elites and from the other parts of colonial society. The war in Europe, particularly the Peninsular War, in which Spanish central government disintegrates, that gives some sort of opportunity. But I suppose as well, the idea that it developed over certainly the preceding 100 years in those areas, that the population in those areas represented a distinct group, and that although there was slavery and although there was oppression, you might see people in South America thinking of themselves as a sort of separate group with interests on their own, and therefore those interests must be separated from Spain. And so again, the experience of people like Bolivar of traveling in Europe, of reading the ideas of the French Revolution, and then of applying them in this way, I think is you know, now is important. So those are some suggestions, Ben, in terms of critical mass. I think often that revolts don't take place when people are at their lowest ebb. They take place when people feel that they can change. That may be at their lowest ebb, but it's when they feel there is an alternative, a possibility of winning. You know, and it's I suppose it's the ideological element that we have to look at, as well as, you know, the economic and the social conditions.
Yes, when they see an alternative. Thank you, Kevin. That was fascinating. Yeah. We're going to go to some other questions now. We've got Ken, and then Tina, and then Matthew.
Hello, Kevin.
Oh, hello, Ken.
Thank you very much for the talk. Fascinating as ever. My question is really the extent to which the Haiti example influenced particularly people in America for the Civil War in the 20th century, and you've referenced that in part because to a level James prophesied that in his 1938 book. And even now, is that something that people cite in the Black Lives Matter movement? Because obviously in the period of the Civil War, how much did the slave population in America know about Haiti? Question mark.
Well, this is a question that's come up in the last couple of sessions, and I'm sometimes accused of being a little bit too optimistic. But I think that people in the early modern period, say from the 16th century on, had a much wider knowledge of the world than we often think. And I actually did a little bit more reading on this issue, partly because I thought it might come up, but also because I was interested to know about what I call the afterlife of these movements. And I was particularly fascinated by the C.L.R. James book because I'd read it in the early 70s. And indeed, when I lived in Lancashire, I knew people that had met C.L.R. James. And I've always been an admirer of him. I suppose what I admired about him was that he saw this revolutionary tradition and believed that it could be an inspiration. C.L.R. James wasn't the only one, actually. There's another one that comes from 1945. This is a Left Book Club. It's a Left Book Club original, Citizen Toussaint by Ralph Cornwell. And that again, I think, attempts something of the same, particularly in a world, in the middle of the 20th century when the colonial empires were still strong. But I was quite surprised to know the extent to which Haiti, the slave revolt, was actually widely known. And in Hazari Singh's account, this new one, the Black Spartacus, he has quite a long chapter on this and cites he cites a number of examples of newspapers that refer specifically to this revolt. Indeed, the slave revolt of Nat Turner, is an example of this. John Brown, the abolitionists, seizure of Harper's Ferry, again refers to Haiti. And in the American Civil War, where we have black units, they often refer to themselves as the sort of Toussaint Brigade. There's a military hospital that's named after him. But the more interesting one is a sort of oral tradition. And this oral tradition, again, gets rather mangled, as these things do. But it does surface in a number of accounts. And again, these are fascinating American websites. And I hope that when Daniel Desar talks about the American Civil War, then we'll pick up on some of this. But there's a sort of oral tradition that talks about Toussaint and his revolt, and even evidence of little sort of medals and sort of memorabilia, almost a bit like some Catholics used to wear crucifixes, or they would wear medals of saints. And this not only is in the case of the United States, but also in other parts of the Caribbean as well. So that some accounts of people who were slaves and after emancipation, indeed their children, talking about the life of slavery, refer to the way that news about, for example, the British Empire abolishing slavery, or the Haitian slave revolt, did pass around. And of course, there's then a political culture as well. People like Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, also refers constantly to Haiti. And, you know, newspapers which are geared primarily at the black, the free black population, but also will then filter down into the slave areas as well, also talk about this. So I think it's more widespread than we think, Ken, is my simple answer. But again, I'm always fascinated by what people know and when they know it.
Okay, thank you.
Am I going? Ben? Yeah? Oops. What happened there? Okay, I think we're both hosting. We're cancelling each other out. Thanks very much, Kevin, for another excellent talk. We did actually, that does touch on issues that we talked about last Tuesday with Jackie. I don't think you made that webinar, but it was quite interesting about the beginnings of slavery and the end, leading up to the end of slavery as well. And she actually described slaves and how they were, you know, exploited on an industrialized scale and mass shipments, etc. She described them as, at the beginning, she described them as the first industrialized people, I think, or the first people of the industrialization, which is quite interesting, which we needed to be exploited. It was necessary to exploit them to form the foundation of capitalism. So that was in that part, they were, you know, involved in the foundation of capitalism. But of course, they were not, in that sense, a working class. You know, there was total force required. So they were an exploited part of the beginnings of capitalism, but not, surely not. I mean, I kind of like to have your take on this, you know, because towards the end of the session, and she did actually call them, or somebody in the audience did, and she said she agreed, sort of the first working class. But surely, I mean, the definition of working class in a Marxist sense is that you sell your labor power, you know, you start negotiating, etc. I mean, you mentioned that slaves had certain negotiating power, I guess, and they could do stoppages, etc. But from a Marxist point of view, surely it's quite a big difference there, or is it more fluid? You know, how the people were exploited in part of slavery. I mean, from a profitable point of view, I guess at the beginning, exploiting slaveries for the sugar trade and exploiting slaves in the sugar trade, etc., was hugely profitable, but it quickly, according to Jackie, and she knows much more about that, it not quickly, but it pretty quickly became very unprofitable because you had to, you know, there's so many deaths for a start.
You're muted.
Am I?
Yes.
Am I now? Still muted?
No, you're fine.
I'm fine now. Okay. So I'm just, before I start ranting on and ranting anymore, but sort of your take on this, you know, were they the beginning of the working class, that kind of exploitation, or is it something totally different because you have to be able to sell your labor power in the sense of the working class that then can liberate itself and liberate all of humanity? I'm sure as a slave class or slave caste or whatever we call it, that's an impossibility. And then she described as well, you know, slavery, how slavery was finished not because of, you know, Wilbur's or Parliament, an act of Parliament, but because it just became unprofitable and it wasn't, you couldn't carry on with it. But your take, if you have a particular take on that, because we did start a little discussion on it in the session on Tuesday, but it didn't get very far. That would interest me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's, I think that's quite an interesting point, not because I would agree. I mean, I agree with your definition of free labor, but because you have in the early stages of capitalism, you've got these two systems side by side, and I think one of the interesting things in the American Civil War with the Lancashire cotton workers who are in solidarity with the black population, the slave population of the Confederate States, is that they identify with them, and they talk about wage slavery, and they talk about the situation that they face. But I think I don't think you can argue that they are a proletariat in any Marxist sense. I think it's also analogous to a very strange formation that you had in parts of Eastern Europe and the Tsarist Empire of factory serfs, where you had forms of serfdom combined with industry. And indeed, in some parts of the American South, you also did actually have factory slaves. I mean, it's not very widespread, and but so the sort of industrialization aspect, I think, isn't just a different form of production; it's a different form of system. Where I think Jackie has it, dead right, is the idea of exploitation, and in a sense, the idea of sort of stealing people and transporting them across the world to work for you, and to exploit them, and then in that way to make profit. And of course, the profit from those industries will then go on to fuel the Industrial Revolution in that way. So the element for me would be that of free labor, the relative efficiency of the system. And indeed, there were some arguments in the American South, as indeed there were in Latin America and indeed in the British colonies, about the relative profitability and efficiency of those systems in that way. I think the other point about slavery is that there is a degree of fluidity in it, and when we talk about the bargaining power and the ability of slaves to determine some aspect of their lives, and I think we have that, and I think the opening stages of the Haitian movement show that, and indeed the nature of some of the leaders and their background show this very sort of fluid situation. So you can't just simply, I think, break it down. But I think there's a clear distinction between a proletariat, particularly its consciousness and its ability to generalize. The slaves did have that ability to go beyond their immediate situation, and this is what I think is interesting in the Haitian case, because they are able to link their local conditions with this general political structure, which just show a sort of an ability to generalize. But in terms of the material resources available to them, and this comes up after the revolutionary period, is how to organize it. Now, Louverture wants to maintain the plantation system. He doesn't want, he doesn't want slavery, but he wants essentially the former slaves to become workers on the plantations. Many of them want to become small farmers. And it's not unlike the problem that the Bolsheviks faced in Russia with the left SRs and the redistribution of land and so on. So you can see that in terms of consciousness and in terms of acting as we think of in terms of the classic proletariat, there are clearly differences. But I think it's an interesting point, because slavery does exist alongside and does contribute to industrialization. It clearly is a resource, and it means that capitalism doesn't necessarily rule out slavery. I mean, the equation of capitalism with freedom, you only have to point to the experience of the southern states in America or the West Indies or whatever to illustrate that. but I think that it is inefficient in capitalist terms, and so you know, can't really be equated. But I'm sure Dan will talk a little bit about that you know, later in the work on the American Civil War, which I think is you know, is a very important discussion.
Thank you, Kevin. We're going to go to Matthew, then Steve.
Hi, folks. I've managed to unmute myself, I hope. No, there's a couple of points. I did agree with Kevin when he's talking about, you know, the point of risings when people would understand there can be something different. And I think it actually applies at the moment, because you can actually see the ruling class is sitting on vast stocks of cash, which it refuses to invest, and is actually at the point where it has this, what you would actually describe as fictitious capital, which doesn't pay the role of capital because it's refusing, because it understands that to a precise point. It doesn't want to give the working class any hope if it can, if it doesn't have to. I think the other thing, my daughter did a study recently, some of these revolutions, and the one thing that you know, she went through all the Bolivarian ones, which are sort of impossibly romantic, with you know, Bolivar and his mates like O'Higgins in Chile, you know, basically wandering around, raising armies of a few thousand, and defeating the local forces and so on, and liberating all these countries. It's an extraordinary story, you know. And then he winds up, you know, basically, you know, saying, "Oh no, I'm finished now. You guys can run the country," and they're saying, "No, you must become, you know, the El Caudillo, the great leader," you know, all this sort of stuff. It's extraordinary. I think the other thing, of course, is that for me is also the response of the, if you like, the counter-revolution to these events. I mean, you know, in terms of Ireland, it's the development by the British of divide and rule, and the deliberate actual creation of the Orange Order by the British in the wake of the United Irishmen, in order to split the Irish population and divide out that Protestant and dissenter element, which was critical to the United Irishmen, actually the leadership of the United Irishmen. And in terms, obviously, in the Haiti of basically of persecution of the entire island for 200 years, and reducing it to the horrible state it's in at the moment. And then, of course, you arrive at in Latin America, immediately after the Monroe Doctrine. The Americans start practicing proto-imperialism and say, well, actually, this is our patch. You know, we'll tell you what happens here, and you can do it if we approve it, and you know, basically you'll do it for us, which is, you know, how they attempt to re-establish control. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Matthew. And just on the Battle of the Album Sleeves, although I noticed you've got CDs, so you're a little more advanced. Cream is taken over from the Stone Roses. Just on Bolivar, yeah, I probably attempted to do too much in a short space of time. I think one comparison though between Bolivar and Louverture is the importance of morale. And Napoleon once argued that victory is 9/10 morale. And I think in both of those movements, we can see where small, often poorly armed forces, you know, can achieve a great deal. It can lead, as you say, to a sort of romantic idea that almost like the prophet turns up in the wilderness, and you know, rather like Robin Hood in all those films, he you know, summons his merry men to the band, and suddenly you know, the revolution starts. Now, you know, that in some ways it is a bit like that, but in other ways it's the ability of people like Louverture and Bolivar to inspire people, and above all to inspire them with some sort of political vision. And I would really recommend, certainly in the case of Louverture, that people read what he proclaimed. He did write a memoir, and you know, there are also other accounts. And I think you could see that someone like him is you know, is a great inspiration. And I think that does bring us back to that sort of subjective that subjective factor that I was, very keen to emphasize, particularly because Lerbertier could converse with people in their own languages. There were many different languages in Haiti, African languages as well as Creole, which is a derivative of French and other languages, and then of course standard French. He could speak, in those languages, and it was also, I suppose, his demotic appeal combined with, the clear, I suppose, power that here he was standing as a representative of this wider revolution. I didn't mention one of the problems that I think that some of the sort of post-revolutionary regimes face, and again, it may well be, in reference to what you might refer to as the sort of subjective factor, and that's the idea of leadership, and particularly the idea that a sort of strong man is, the leader. One of the things about the French Revolution is that in the Thermidorian period, the emergence of Napoleon, that there is a sort of almost a Napoleon worship, and indeed this will extend into the 19th century. So the sort of caudillo type of Bolivar is going to be a feature in Latin America, the man who embodies the nation. And maybe the American sort of monarchical presidency did something of the same. Also, I think it sort of points to this other problem that we've been talking about in terms of consciousness, and of that the French Revolution opens the door to the ideas of popular sovereignty, but then what we need to do is to push those doors open and say it's not just a case of you have the right, but you must exercise it. It isn't just a case of leaders; it's a case of followers in that way. I wouldn't overstate it, but you can see, for example, in contemporary Venezuela with the so-called Chavismo. You can even see in with the election victory of the MAS in Bolivia, you can see not only elements of this sort of idea of the leader, but you can also see the attempts by contemporary America to extend the Monroe Doctrine, which in its most violent contemporary form wasn't only supporting the Contras in Nicaragua and also other fairly horrific regimes in Guatemala and El Salvador, but of course the coup in 1973 in Chile. That's what the modern Monroe Doctrine is about. Again, I think you're spot on, Matthew, about the fear of the ruling class in Britain. I think they were genuinely afraid of a revolution in the 1790s. The laws that were passed, the arrests, the executions, and indeed it was a fairly ruthless suppression of the United Irish Movement. The British had a policy that was nicknamed pitch capping, which was where pitch, which is essentially tar, the sort of stuff you get on the roads, and which was then boiled up and put into a sort of receptacle, like a cap, then placed over the head of the unfortunate prisoner. And also another interesting invention, the mobile gallows, which you could just sort of, hang somebody from, almost like a little sort of like a table tennis net, like the frame that holds that. You just attach the frame to the side of the cart and you've got a ready-made gallows. So those sorts of repressions were very important. But it was in fact the longer term fear that the population would unite for radical democracy and for independence that, as Matthew says, the Orange Order, which really comes into existence in this period, in 1795, 1796, that shows the determination of the rulers to keep down any movements for democracy and independence. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. We're going to go to Steve now.
Hi, Kevin.
Oh, hi, Steve.
Hi, how are you doing? All right. Thank
Good,
you for your
yes.
talk. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting, and it's made me think of some other channels and things to go and look at in more detail. Thanks. That was very good. Excellent. I wanted to ask a question of you, but I wanted to sort of start from today rather than from the past. So I'd like to start by saying that I think that we've got such a political crisis in this country right now. We've got a crisis of our state. We've got a crisis in our democracy with coronavirus and all these other things, and that something has to be done about our democracy. I mean, I think that to me seems to be pretty clear. We've got this political crisis, a state which is kind of failing. Now, I can see the rise of English nationalism on the right, because that's broken out through Brexit and the election of the Tories and the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn. So there's English nationalism. So my question is, I wonder where English republicanism is. What's the Jacobin party in England? Because I would like to think that the Labour Left Alliance could become a voice for republicanism in the Labour Party, by the way, because Tony Benn, of course, was doing some of this work. So if we're going to learn our lessons about republicanism, then this is where it all is. It's all in all of these particular things. This is the Republican history of the world, how we got to be republics, what movements, what brought them about. Get rid of all the myths and see how these things came about in these are early cases of it, of course. So we started in 1649, 1778, 1789, and now this particular tranche that you're talking about here. And we can also see that having a republic doesn't mean you've got a democracy. We've got kind of elected monarchies coming out of here, as you said, in these particular cases. So there's a lot more to republicanism than just the word. Is it really democratic? And you've got to go there. So what you've got is the conditions in all these revolutions of oppression. You have movements. There are movements below that before this comes. Before the republic comes, there's got to be a movement. And there's got to be some kind of Jacobin party of some sort or other. I mean, there was the Levellers, there was the Jacobins, and what are the parties that are involved in this? You need a party to make a republic. They don't come about just by the spontaneous revolts of people. Everywhere you see republics coming, there are parties that are putting forward the ideas of democracy, sovereignty, nation, equality, liberty, solidarity, all these values of the French Revolution. Are world values. They're not, as you stated quite clearly, this is a world history. It's not just a French history. So my question, I suppose, is the relevance of these things, are they relevant today in this country, which is still a constitutional monarchy in a terrible crisis? Okay.
Well, thanks, Steve. I agree, and I agree that the idea of a republic, and indeed of political demands around democracy, still are absolutely vital questions. And I think you and I would agree that one of the failures on the political left has been to either focus on, let's say, I think it was Badger talked about the ceremonial aspects of the monarchy. Arguments that we spend too much on the monarchy, or talk about the fripperies or the personalities, or perhaps even more so, just the sort of expense. My argument about the importance of the republic and of democracy is, I suppose, much more wide-ranging than that, because in raising the question of a republic in Britain, you're raising the question of political power and the nature of that power. Many comrades on the left would say, well, we have to focus on economic power, and, that this may well be something of a distraction. But I think it's what the monarchy absolutely represents. It isn't, for example, that it does in many aspects of public life sort of infantilize us, or it turns us into children, or even that that the monarchy is a sort of smoke screen for other things. I think that the failure of the political system that Steve alludes to, clearly focuses on monarchical power, particularly when that monarchical power is exercised through a prime minister that uses or prime ministers, it's not a particular individual, but the way that the monarchical power is then transferred to a prime minister, and the way that the nature of the so-called British Constitution allows that power to be concentrated, and for the real power relations, to be obscured. So I think those political demands are absolutely central, and they're central not just because of the way they might distort discourse, but because in raising ideas of popular sovereignty and democracy and exposing that, we also then say, well, what takes its place? A republic, but what's the content of that republic? What's the nature of that republic? And I think, the rather sort of limited debate that there's ever been, and also the way that the history of the struggles for republicanism in Britain have been portrayed as either the work of cranks or of people who sort of miss the wrong target. I think that's why, programs or programs of talks like this are so important in raising that. But the revolutionaries of the 17th and 18th century, as you know, Steve, linked their call for a republic for other social changes. And of course, the republic is the beginning. It's absolutely essential. It does focus on where power lies in this country and the nature of parliamentary democracy. But it then also has to be linked to those wider social and economic questions, and particularly about why the capitalist status quo is more than willing to obscure the nature of power through the monarchical system. But I think the other point as well, why the republic isn't enough, or it doesn't stand alone, is of course that as Marxists and socialists in the 19th and early 20th centuries realized, there were plenty of European republics, the American Republic, the French Republic, which were pristine republics, but they were still they were not democratic. And so this is just part of a general program of transformation. But to simply dismiss it as unimportant, I think, is to dismiss not just a figurehead and a symbol, which is the way that many people regard it, but actually to misunderstand the nature of power, political power, which is what we should really be focusing on. No.
Thank you, Kevin. We're going to go to Susan and then Daniel, please.
Hi. My question is, you mentioned the importance of religion and how powerful it was. It took me back to an incident when I was doing VSO in Sudan in the 1960s. And I was teaching at it was all obviously an Islamic school, and they appointed this Coptic Christian headmistress. And the leader of the army barracks decided he didn't like that because women shouldn't be in charge of things. And he came to try and take the school over, and she just locked the gates against him, refused to let him in, which was wonderful. But it was kind of that was a kind of Muslim Christian conflict, I suppose. But then you get the Catholic Protestant thing that you get in Ireland as well. And I wondered how important you thought religion was in what you've been talking about, really. How influential it was.
Yes, and that's a nice story, by the way. And Susan, I think it shows direct action. It's not usual by headmistresses, but it's to be applauded. The interesting thing about religion in general is that it's obviously a very contradictory force. And one of the things particularly about Haiti is that the religious composition of the population is I think complex. It wasn't officially say officially, the French state was Catholic, and you know, there were active attempts by the Catholic Church, particularly Jesuits, to convert and indeed to inculcate Catholicism amongst the population. But that was also combined with with other religious practices, which are generally referred to as voodoo, which, you know, through popular culture tends to demean them a little bit. But I mean, we can say that they're African religions, and they often sit alongside Catholicism. Why I think it was politically important in this instance was that we know from some of Leviter's speeches and proclamations that Christian symbolism and ideas, particularly in terms of magnanimity to enemies and opponents, you know, love thy neighbor and so forth, were quite common. And we also know from other aspects of his own life that various priests and others had been, you know, quite influential in his own education and so forth. So, you know, to that regard, I think it was quite important, and it would be wrong to always see religions as oppressive forces. It's more, I suppose, if you want to look at it sociologically, it's an ideological resource that people can draw upon. I mean, we only have to think of the experience of this country, where there are people who, you know, may well have been non-conformists, who become involved in political movements and adapt the language of religion to politics. I remember reading, I think it was by Trotsky, but he describes Lenin and himself going to a chapel in North London, where he says that the minister is sort of speaking pure communism. And so I think that the religious element, particularly in these early movements, you know, shouldn't be ignored. I think it's less so in Latin America, or rather the function, because the nature of the revolt and the revolution is different. In the Irish case, I think again you've hit on something that's quite important, and again, because of the focus on two groups called Catholics and Protestants, the subtleties of the impact of religion are often not fully developed. So, for example, many of the leaders of the United Irishmen were Presbyterians and or various other dissenters who were politically excluded, and indeed were seen, because of their connections with subversive religious ideas, are often seen as much of a threat to the established order as Catholics. Well, one of the arguments that emerges after the French Revolution, and it applies in England as well as in Ireland, is that people argue that France is a Catholic country, and yet it's been able to throw off its chains, and it shows that the French people are capable of liberty. And if that's the case in a Catholic country like France, then does that not show that Catholics are not permanently oppressed by the priesthood, as it were, that they will always permanently be counter-revolutionaries? So the experience of the French Revolution encouraged many dissenting Protestants that Catholics could, you know, be partners in revolution, that they too could undergo these sort of processes of radicalization, if you want, that they would not, you know, be a group that was constantly, you know, clouded in superstition, as many of them might have seen it. Also, there's a very clear link between Enlightenment philosophy, dissenting religion, particularly the connections between Scotland and Ireland, the University of Glasgow, people like Francis Hutchinson, and so on, people who are, you know, radical Democrats in religion, and then become, you know, radical Democrats in politics. And I think this relationship between religion and politics is very important. In Ireland, what will happen, as Matthew alluded to earlier, what will happen in Ireland in the years to come will be that the state will not only attempt to sow that division, for example, by mobilizing extreme Protestantism in the form of the Orange Order, but even the creation of an idea of Protestantism as something that includes Anglicanism, which was the established church, and then the dissenters. I mean, if you think back to your history of the 17th and 18th century, things like the Test Acts and the Corporation Acts all removed any political influence from nonconformists. You know, nonconformists couldn't go to universities. That's why dissenting academies were established in the in the late 1780s. So what the state does is in the Irish case is not only to emphasize the differences between Catholics and the rest of the population, but also to establish the elements of Protestant unity. And indeed, the idea of Protestants being an homogeneous group. Indeed, if you go back to the quote I gave from Wolfe Tone, he talks about uniting Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter. And the Protestants at that point are the Anglicans, and the dissenters are Presbyterians and Congregationists and so on. So religion does have that role. It's both an ideological resource for counter-revolution, as in the case of the Orange Order, but it's also a way that many people look at the world and they draw revolutionary conclusions from their religion. So, you know, it has all these contradictions.
Thank you, Kevin. We'll go to Daniel, and then we will give you a chance to summarize. Thank you.
Hi, Kevin. Excellent talk. Thank you very much. I just wanted to point out about the confusions of the time. There were a lot of cross currents, a lot of contradictions. In America, for example, there was extremely strong pro-French revolutionary sentiment in the 1790s. And the Jeffersonians were at the forefront of this, the Jeffersonian Democrats. And the Federalists, who were based throughout the colonies, but mainly in the middle Atlantic states and New England, were extremely hostile to the Jacobins. But what's funny is that the Jeffersonians were at the same time extremely hostile to the Haitian Revolution. And the Federalists were much friendlier. And when Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in 1800, it was often known as the Revolution of 1800, which supposedly inaugurated a new democratic period in the United States. It also ushered in a new period of hostility between the U.S. and the Haitian Republic. So the American Democrats, small d Democrats, were anti-Haitian because they were racist, and they had enjoyed large support in the South among planters, and the Federalists, who were often upper class, were anti-racist and pro-Haitian. And there's a direct line from the Federalists to the abolitionists of the 1820s and 30s, just as there's a straight line between the Jeffersonians and the Confederacy of the 1860s. So it's very, very strange, very confused, really screwed up.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. I was only vaguely aware of that distinction, partly because of some negotiations, I think, for a commercial treaty and diplomatic relations between Haiti and the American Republic, particularly in that period. The Constitution of 1800 in Haiti is a de facto independent constitution, but the formal Declaration of Independence comes later. But the fact that they're having dealings with John Adams and so on, I think it does have some significance. Yes, I think the cross currents are interesting ones, and I think the other interesting currents are the way that in the period after, with the retelling of both the events leading up to the Civil War and indeed of the whole history of this period, is that those complexities are often simplified or indeed completely ironed out. And one of the problems, I think, in all types of history, whatever period we're looking at, is the need to explain and maybe the need to clarify and to move away from the very easy and the very simple. And that's particularly true of revolutionary movements in this period, of simply idealizing all of the leaders, or indeed denigrating them. And I think that I think what's quite good about looking back at it is it's a chance to look at things that we sort of half know, but maybe need to re-examine. But also for many of us, and American history that you referred to there, Daniel, is a good example of that we've often got a very simplified version of it, and in that sense, it actually disables our understanding of the nature of America and its politics. I'd just like to conclude then, thanking everybody for coming in for their comments. I'd like to leave you with the idea, I suppose, of possibility. One of the things about revolutions is that the ones that fail, of which there are very many, are often looked upon either romantically, Matthew referred to that, they're often looked upon as rather romantic failures, or alternatively, they're just they're given what Ian Birchall said in his account of Babeuf, the condescension of posterity, that we simply look back at these madmen who believe that they could establish democratic republics, or that they could ever liberate themselves, or in the case of Ireland, that these supposedly age-old divisions between Catholic, Protestant, and Dissenter couldn't be overcome. And I've always had, as an individual, I've always had a very strong sense of history. I mean, it's an interest and passion of mine, but I've always had a sense that I am like, millions of people the world over, and also millions of people throughout history have attempted to fight for a different world, for a better world, for human liberation. And then when I read about these, when I read about these people, when I read about their struggles, and the military struggles of Bolivar, or the campaigns of Toussaint Louverture are heroic. They're full of magnificent adventures, bravery, heroism, sacrifice, all of these things. So they are inspirational. But I think they also show us that our project, which all comrades on the left, in a sense, are part of, that our project for human liberation has been a long one. It's been a constant one, and it's one that has been a very hard road. The other point about these projects as well is that they're often distorted, or even worse than that, they're ignored. And the battle for history, the battle for history in the education system, the battle for history, our own history and our own movement, I think is absolutely vital. Because the discussions and the ideas that that we're engaged in, people have engaged in them before. It's not to say that there are lessons. It's not to, or direct lessons. It's not to say that we treat the past as a textbook and we just take bits out of it. But I think it is useful for us to explore these particular points. I tried to link the three revolutionary movements together. They're spread across thousands of miles. They're part of that Atlantic world. When you then link into Africa, you link into transatlantic slavery, you link into South America, the West Indies, America, and Europe. then you can see the way that the world is linking up. And just as oppression is international, then I think the struggle for liberation is international. And these comrades, and I would regard them as comrades, then that means we, we can draw inspiration from them. We can do likewise. We can struggle with our comrades elsewhere. So let's learn that particular history, and when we come to the next few sessions, let's look at as the way that people are starting to look not just at their political or their national oppression, but also at their social oppression. When we look at the development of socialist ideas, and then the first European revolutionary movement in 1848. But that's in the next couple of weeks, and that's all to look forward to. So thank you, comrades, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you, KB. Absolute masterclass. Pitch capping, that's something that will stick with me. I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the praise in the background. And from an LLA perspective, we're all glad you're feeling better. We need you on board, comrade. And next week, we're back to Europe, the springtime of the peoples, the 1848 revolution, 50 countries affected, truly tumultuous. Concessions of the aristocracy, the middle classes getting stuck in, the emergence of social democracy, perhaps, arguably the biggest enemy of emancipation, challenges to change, not one to miss. See you next week, comrades. Educate, organize, and fight. Good night.